In 1942, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, brings Blitzkrieg to Egypt. All that stands between his panzers and Cairo is the British 8th Army. General Bernard Montgomery must fight back in the desert dunes. Now, newly colorized footage takes us to the heart of the action. 100-degree heat, brutal sandstorms, and swarms of flies create punishing fighting conditions. As German fighter aces dominate the skies, British battleships contest the seas. The Battle of El Alamein will decide the fate of North Africa. British Flight Lieutenant Robert Millward records his descent into the Egyptian capital, Cairo. Europe is on the brink of war, but 2,000 miles from London, Millward has time to see the sights. The pyramids at Giza are top of any tourist list. Millward saves much of his film for the Great Pyramid, the last intact wonder of the ancient world. But he's not here for R&R. He's collecting new Bristol Blenheim bombers, destined for the front lines of the coming war.
The British have maintained a colonial presence in Egypt since the late 19th century. They fight against the Ottoman Turks to defend it during the First World War, and they prepare to do so again against the Germans and Italians during the Second World War.
The jewel in Egypt's crown is the Suez Canal.
The Suez Canal is the lifeline of the British Empire. It's the link between the British Isles and that gigantic Asian empire that sustains Britain.
Ships carrying oil from Iran, food from India, or troops from Australia can use the canal as a shortcut between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. It saves a 2-week detour around Africa on each trip. But it makes North Africa coveted real estate for ambitious imperial powers. In the German city of Munich, Führer Adolf Hitler receives Italian Duce, Benito Mussolini. The two men have formed a fascist military alliance known as the Axis.
Hitler has great success in Europe in the early stages of the Second World War. But Mussolini is frustrated by the rather limited Italian contribution.
For fascism, the growth of empire is an essential manifestation of vitality, and its opposite a sign of decadence.
Mussolini's great vision is to rebuild Italy in the image of the ancient Roman Empire. Italy already has colonies in North Africa, and Mussolini wants to link these up and create a new Italian empire in that part of the world.
Mussolini orders his troops to invade Egypt. It's a disaster. Mussolini's armada is a far cry from Hitler's Wehrmacht. Much like their plumed helmets, their equipment dates back to an earlier era. Instead of a blitz, their tactics rely on static encampments and a slow advance. Just 30,000 British soldiers push 150,000 Italians back into Libya.
It was a complete walkover. I saw thousands of Italian prisoners delighted that the war was over.
If Italy fails in Africa, the southern borders of the Third Reich will become vulnerable. Hitler is alarmed by this turn of events.
The British would have free use of a dozen divisions. We must make every effort to prevent this. We must render effective assistance in North Africa.
Nazi propaganda film crews tout the arrival of the new Afrika Korps in the Libyan capital, Tripoli. It's the first time German forces have traveled this far south, but they say they are prepared for the 115-degree heat. The soldiers sport new olive-colored desert uniforms, made from lightweight cotton instead of wool, and topped with a wide-brimmed sun helmet. Steel Panzer Mark III tanks will act as an oven in the fierce sun, so they add cooling ports to the engine hatches. Watching on is their newly appointed commander, the Maverick General, Erwin Rommel.
General Rommel is Hitler's favorite field commander. He has what Hitler wants: boldness, surprise, speed. He's sent to North Africa simply to support the Italian ally. But as the world is about to find out, you rarely limit Rommel in terms of his aims.
400 miles east of Tripoli, the Afrika Korps pass under the Arch of Fellaini. This 100-foot-high ornate landmark straddles the only road between Tripoli and Cairo. It was commissioned by Mussolini as part of his attempt to recreate the Roman Empire. The inscription at the top reads, "O Almighty Son, you will never look upon a city greater than Rome." Rommel may disagree.
Technically, Rommel is under Italian command, but he chooses to ignore the Italian orders to simply defend Libya. His idea is to win North Africa, to gain glory for the German army, and of course, personal glory for himself.
It is during the pursuit, when the beaten enemy is still dispirited and disorganized, that most prisoners are made and most booty captured.
To take Cairo and the Suez Canal, Rommel must cross 750 miles of the northern Sahara Desert.
The landscape is incredibly hostile. It's arid, there's very limited water, the troops are dehydrated for much of their time. It's a very unpleasant environment, hot by day, freezing by night.
The desert will push any army and its supply lines to the limit. The one defending the settlements that cling to the North African coastline is a hastily assembled fighting force.
The only way the British Empire can keep pace with Axis mobilization is by drawing upon the resources of the British Empire, the colonies, the dominions, and Britain's allies.
British tank crews are joined by large infantry divisions from Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand, who include a battalion of Maori tribal soldiers. The 4th Indian Division features a section of motorcycling military police. These disparate divisions will become known as the British 8th Army, but they initially struggle to operate effectively.
8th Army is torn between fighting the Axis forces in Africa and contributing strength to Britain's ongoing campaigns elsewhere. There's also a failure to concentrate force effectively and to instill cooperation between the different arms.
Rommel catches them cold. In March 1941, the Panzer Army Africa descend from the desert dunes and attack the British camp at El Agila. Wrecked vehicles are left behind by the hasty British retreat. By the end of the day, Rommel is surveying the captured city and already pushing on to the next target.
Rommel has a small force, a division plus, maybe a division and a half. But because it's so small, he can whip it around in a way that the British simply cannot match, and frankly, cannot even understand.
British vehicles are old and worn out. Under pressure, they break down, and organized retreat turns into harried flight.
It seemed that everyone was doing their best to put the greatest distance between themselves and the enemy. Everybody was rushing headlong back to Egypt.
Rommel's success makes him a German hero. This film footage from the desert becomes a highlight of the German Weekly Review, a propaganda newsreel series released in cinemas across the Reich. For audiences used to snowy struggles of the Eastern Front, the unstoppable advance in Africa is a welcome morale boost.
Front Nordafrika, Panzerkampfwagen des Deutschen Afrikakorps.
Rommel is ever present on screen, surveying destroyed vehicles and captured territory. He plays up to the cameras. British anti-gas goggles found in a captured command vehicle soon become a trademark. The newsreels dub him Der Wüstenfuchs, the Desert Fox. German morale is high. In their downtime, they create a makeshift fun fair complete with boxing ring, carousel, and strength test. A chameleon gives camouflage tips, and even a tortoise is recruited to the Nazi cause.
The desert is a completely alien territory for the German army. The German soldiers have never fought in a similar terrain, under similar heat. Their training is all concentrated on a war in Europe.
It's so hot, they can fry eggs on their panzers. But there is little time to sleep during the relentless advance.
Every night we were completely exhausted. We had only one thought: let's get to Cairo. This is where we really wanted to go.
The newsreel footage is not just overblown propaganda. Rommel's troops are forcing the British army back across the barren desert towards Egypt. In June 1942, Rommel seizes the last British stronghold in Libya, the port town of Tobruk. The Nazis take 32,000 captives. German propaganda cameras record the moment the garrison commander, Major General Kloppe, surrenders. With the port in their hands, fresh supplies power the Afrika Korps towards the Egyptian border. On the same day at the White House, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill visits President Franklin D. Roosevelt. As U.S. troops parade down New York's Fifth Avenue, the men plan America's first deployment to the European War. A massive invasion of North Africa. But they fear Egypt will fall before the U.S. can mobilize. As a stopgap, Roosevelt agrees to send some of America's most advanced tanks and mobile artillery to the desert, if Britain can hold Egypt long enough for them to get there. After taking Tobruk, Rommel is promoted to Field Marshal and given full control over all 100,000 Axis forces in North Africa. As they enter Egypt, Rommel's focus turns to Cairo. Take it, and he will control North Africa and the Suez Canal. British civilians in the city, alarmed by the news from the border, begin a mass evacuation. Author Olivia Manning observes the panic.
We were amazed to find uproar when we reached the station, the train packed with every sort of European refugee. The Egyptian porters entered into the excitement, with shouts of "Germans coming, you go, Germans come."
After 50 years of British occupation, many Egyptians see the Germans as liberators. But to the British, they're a threat, approaching at full speed across the sand. And now also from the air. Home movie footage, shot by members of Luftwaffe Fighter Wing 27, shows graders scraping airfields from the desert, ready for the arrival of German air power.
During the early stages of the campaign, the German Luftwaffe is able to fight successfully against a weakened Royal Air Force and to support the German operations on the ground.
In the skies over the desert, gun cameras attached to the Messerschmitt Bf-109 aircraft reveal the high-speed fighter's distinct advantage. A few direct hits from wing-mounted 20mm cannons are all they need to send the slower British Hurricanes down. Newsreels make German aces celebrities. Hans-Joachim Marseille is fresh from the Battle of Britain. There, he had a reputation as a skilled but reckless pilot and a womanizer. He's often grounded for being too tired to fly sorties. But he embraces the asceticism of desert life and becomes a hero to the Hitler youth camps back home. He gains fame for extreme attack angles and diving right into the middle of enemy formations.
You gotta be able to shoot from any position, from left or right turns, out of a roll, on your back. Only then can you plunge into the middle of an enemy swarm and blow it up from the inside.
Marseille's aircraft tail is decorated for his 100th kill. Nazi propaganda names him the Star of Africa, a walking example of German dominance of the desert skies. On the ground, the British 8th Army has retreated back into Egypt. The dire situation warrants a personal visit from the British Prime Minister.
By going to Egypt, Winston Churchill wants to demonstrate that he's got command of the situation, both to the British public, but more importantly to his American allies.
Churchill insists Rommel must be defeated and Axis forces pushed out of North Africa. This considerable challenge requires a top talent to oversee the ground forces.
Churchill's initial pick to lead the 8th Army is Lieutenant General William Strafer Gott, who's a veteran of the Desert War. But as he's flying to take up his appointment, he's shot down by a German Messerschmitt and he's burnt to death in the wreckage.
Out of options, Churchill agrees to the appointment of Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery.
In a profession known for gigantic personalities, Montgomery might have been near the top. Even his own British colleagues see him as arrogant and self-obsessed and just a thoroughly unpleasant personality.
But Montgomery is also a highly experienced commander with a keen eye for detail.
Every nuance has to be perfect before he's ready to march, and he won't march until he is absolutely certain of success.
As he whips the 8th Army into shape, Montgomery is a constant visible presence, building a reputation to rival Rommel's. Instead of goggles, he adopts a black tank regiment beret to connect with the rank and file.
When he wanted something to happen, it happened. After he arrived, morale soared.
Under Montgomery's guidance, the 8th Army begins to punch back. Rommel's advance stalls near the small railroad station of El Alamein. The new front line is just 150 miles west of Cairo. The terrain here presents a natural choke point. To the north, the sea. To the south, a vast unpassable expanse of salt marshes known as the Qatar Depression. The 25-mile stretch of rocky desert in between forces a tactical battle of wits. Rommel wants to keep the Allies on the defensive.
When the first attempt to break through the British lines at Alamein fails, Rommel decides to dig in. He hopes that he will be able to bring up more reinforcements to the front line in order to relaunch the offensive.
Between July and October, Axis engineers create a 3-mile deep killing zone of defensive positions, mines, and barbed wire. They christen them the Devil's Gardens. Panzer divisions patrol, ready to react to Allied breakthroughs. If Montgomery is to achieve his task of pushing Rommel out of Africa, the 8th Army must find a way through these brutal defenses. the British 8th Army and German and Italian Panzer Army Africa dig in for the impending battle at El Alamein. Now they bear the brunt of the brutal desert conditions.
The North African desert creates enormous wear and tear on the troops' vehicles, on their equipment, on their weapons, and it's a very difficult environment for the human body too.
Vast sandstorms scour the soldiers. Wind speeds can reach 90 miles an hour.
We gasped in breath painfully through handkerchiefs held over our faces, and sweat poured off our bodies in the unbearable heat.
Once the storm passes, swarms of sandflies arrive. Drawn to food, human waste, and dead bodies, they are a relentless nuisance.
Flies get into the food, contaminate fluids, and can turn even fairly minor wounds septic.
Despite signs urging the Germans to boil water before use, disease is common. Rommel himself contracts dysentery and jaundice, which lead to a liver infection, low blood pressure, and fainting fits. On September 22nd, he flies back to Germany to recuperate. Just as Rommel departs the desert, help arrives for the British 8th Army. Testing footage from the Detroit Tank Arsenal in Warren, Michigan, shows the capabilities of the new Sherman M4 tank. With a top speed of 25 miles per hour, it can keep up with the German Panzers, and like them, has a rotating central turret to give the 75mm gun all-round fire. But the armor is an inch thicker than the Panzer Mark IV.
Sherman is a very well-designed medium-sized tank, which combines a powerful gun with good armament and speed of maneuver. And this gives the Allies the upper hand in the North African campaign.
318 Sherman tanks and 100 Priest 105mm self-propelled guns roll into the desert. Enough firepower and armor to match Rommel's panzers. Montgomery begins to plan a major offensive of his own. First, he needs to reclaim the skies over the battlefield. The Desert Air Force takes off.
The aircraft of the Desert Air Force are aging but numerous, and they're trying to overwhelm the German aircraft that are technologically more advanced but available in far more limited numbers.
The fighting begins to take a toll on the outnumbered Luftwaffe. Hans Joachim Marseille loses weight when two of his closest friends are shot down. He starts sleepwalking and stops talking, signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. On September 30th, his Messerschmitt suffers engine trouble and goes into a dive. Marseille attempts to jump, but miscalculates. He smashes into the tail, then plummets to the desert floor. His body can only be identified by medals on the uniform. Once it's recovered, Italian engineers construct a pyramid shrine on the spot he was found. A replica stands there to this day. Every Axis aircraft lost reduces their ability to control the skies. During October, their numbers fall from 770 to just 350, and the British Royal Air Force begin to dominate the desert. Now Montgomery's ground offensive at El Alamein can begin. It's codenamed Operation Lightfoot. Infantry will lead the attack, moving through the minefields and clearing paths for the tanks. The attack will start with a massive artillery bombardment. 5.5-inch medium guns can fire a 100-pound shell over 9 miles. They aim for the furthest German positions. Closer to the front, the numerous 25-pound guns open up. The new American-made Priest mobile artillery gets in on the action too.
The whole horizon spewed heavenwards, in a fount of orange and blood-red flame. A tidal wave of sound hammered on our eardrums and whipped our shirts against our chests.
Montgomery's insistence on close communication pays off. Each one of the first 882 shells land at exactly the same moment.
The whole sky was red with gunfire. Shells were howling over you, exploding around you. It was just horrible. We thought the world was coming to an end.
The initial artillery bombardment is hugely effective. It destroys German and Italian guns, it causes casualties amongst the infantry, it cuts the communication lines, and it also has a very severe effect on the morale of the enemy.
Under artillery cover, the minesweepers move in. Operation Lightfoot's name is apt. The infantry charged with clearing the mines will want to tread carefully. It's one of the war's most nerve-wracking jobs. Some are lucky enough to get mine detectors, but most infantry just use bayonets to prod the ground. Thousands of mines must be carefully unearthed and diffused to provide a path wide enough for the tanks.
In the face of enemy fire, the sappers worked steadily on, keeping to their drill. It takes guts to stay standing up when everyone else is either running forward or lying down.
But under heavy fire, the minesweepers can only clear narrow paths. Tank columns advance but run out of space and become gridlocked. Tracks churn up dust. Entire columns head the wrong way. As dawn breaks, German artillery spots the unprotected Allied armor stuck in the sand.
Suddenly, all hell broke loose. The tank crews saw armor-piercing tracer shells screaming from all over the place. Then the explosions of tanks blowing up, sheets of flame as they caught fire.
Montgomery is ruthless when it comes to accepting Allied casualties in this operation. He understands that he needs to fight his way through the German and Italian positions, and he's willing to accept high casualties on the Allied side in order to achieve this.
Battle rages up and down the 25-mile line. The 8th Army inflict heavy damage, but the Panzer Army Africa do not concede much ground. The battle hangs in the balance. On the evening of October 25th, a rested Erwin Rommel returns to North Africa and takes personal control of the battle. The Desert Fox prepares his panzers to push back. Rommel has over 100,000 troops and 500 tanks at his command. But they're under pressure, consuming vast amounts of food and fuel.
Rommel's entire front at El Alamein is determined by logistics. Every bullet, every bottle of water, every pair of socks has to be shipped from Europe to North Africa and then to the El Alamein front by truck. Supply is the limiting factor for Rommel.
Most vital is fuel. The tanks and the trucks supplying them demand 66,000 gallons every day. With no place to hide in the desert, the supply chain is an obvious target for the British Royal Air Force. Nose cameras from Bristol Beaufighter ground attack aircraft reveal Axis supply convoys being strafed at close range. The supply lines are especially vulnerable to the RAF aircraft based on a small British island colony still holding out in the center of the Mediterranean, Malta.
Malta provides the Allies with a base in the central Mediterranean, which some liken to an unsinkable aircraft carrier from which they can launch anti-shipping strikes at the supply lines sustaining Axis forces in Africa.
In 1942, the Luftwaffe began a campaign to bomb Malta into submission. There are 154 days of continuous air raids. 6,700 tons of bombs fall on the Grand Harbor area alone. The 250,000 islanders determinedly struggle for survival.
We did not have anything to eat. Always hungry. Community kitchens provided us with food, but we were never satisfied.
By summer, Malta is almost out of food, fuel, and ammunition. Germany draws up plans for an invasion. If the island falls, Rommel will be able to build up his forces unchallenged. The British government devised an audacious scheme to relieve the island. Operation Pedestal. 14 merchant ships packed with supplies enter the Mediterranean. At the center of the fleet is the SS Ohio, the biggest American tanker built to this point, transporting 170,000 barrels of fuel for the planes defending the island. Protecting this precious cargo are 2 battleships, 3 aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. The largest naval escort force in the war so far. The Germans take notice. Cameras on the ships film Axis aircraft flying towards the fleet, and anti-aircraft crews rushing to man the guns as they return fire. British destroyers drop depth charges to ward off marauding U-boats. Tracer rounds illuminate the evening sky as the Royal Navy blasts away at the German bombers. The SS Ohio comes under concentrated attack. War correspondent Anthony Kimmins is on board.
If ever there was an example of dogged perseverance against all odds, this was it. Any of those hundreds of bombs in the right place, and she would have gone up in a sheet of flame.
The Allies suffer heavy losses. Over 500 sailors and airmen are killed. 9 of the 14 merchant ships are destroyed. Finally, the remaining convoy reaches Malta. Crucially, the SS Ohio has made it through, but only just. The massive tanker was hit by a torpedo and is so badly damaged it must be towed into the harbor. It will never sail again. Maltese dockworkers frantically unload the vital fuel from the sinking ship. It allows the British Royal Air Force to continue to wreak havoc on the Axis supply lines.
1/3 of Rommel's supply ships are going to be sunk in the course of this campaign. It's a big problem for the Germans.
In the desert, Rommel's mounting supply setbacks make it difficult to react to the Allied pressure at El Alamein. By late October, his Panzer Army is reduced to fewer than 300 operational tanks. Montgomery knows that if he can draw them into the open and take them out, the Axis position will become unsustainable. He orders a massive offensive. Operation Supercharge will be led by New Zealand and British infantry. They will attempt to create a funnel for 2 further waves of tanks and self-propelled guns. It will be the biggest concentration of force in North Africa so far. At 1 a.m., hundreds of British troops go over the top.
There was the deafening crash of the shells bursting, dispersed with fierce bursts of fire from German and British Tommy guns. And occasionally the crash of a British hand grenade exploding in a trench.
The battlefield becomes a confusion of heavy smoke and swirling sand, hiding the Axis positions. The Devil's Garden is living up to its name. The right flank of the New Zealand infantry advance is entrusted to the 28th Maori Battalion. Newly restored footage from the New Zealand archives shows the soldiers in their homeland as they prepare to depart for war. Descended from the indigenous Polynesian people who settled in New Zealand 600 years ago, the Maori are proud to show off their distinctive South Pacific culture for the cameras. They perform the haka, a war challenge staged when different tribes meet. Intimidating tongue and facial gestures, as well as displays of weapons and fighting moves, indicate the performing group's readiness for a fight. It will be put to the test in Operation Supercharge.
I heard someone calling my name, saying he was badly hit. We couldn't stop and carried on. Right at that moment, a bullet passed through the butt of my weapon.
The 28th Maori Battalion suffer over 100 casualties, but they hold the right flank. The infantry cut a large channel through the Axis' desert defenses, but further back, a formidable line of German artillery and anti-tank guns is still intact. It's going to take something heavier than infantry to take them out. 94 Sherman and Grant tanks of the British 9th Armored Brigade blast across the open terrain. With no cover, the German guns wreak havoc on their advance. The losses mount, but Montgomery is committed to the action. He sends over 100 tanks from the 1st Armored Division to join the battle. As they advance, the remaining German and Italian tanks finally counterattack. El Alamein is now a clash of tank versus tank. Captain Keith Douglas experiences the battle inside a British Crusader tank.
The turret was full of fumes and smoke. Empty cartridge and shell cases littered the floor. I coughed and sweated. Fear had given place to exhilaration. The enemy fire grew more intense. I crouched in the turret, expecting at any moment the crash which would bring our disintegration.
It's a grind, and the British take huge casualties, much heavier than expected. But the Germans take even heavier ones. The German Panzer Force is decimated by Operation Supercharge.
Burning tanks dominate the landscape. The Panzer Army Africa had 500 at the start of the offensive. Only 35 remain. Montgomery knows victory must be near. "24 hours into Operation Supercharge, British 8th Army Infantry launched renewed attacks along the front line. With no tanks left to support them, the Axis defenders in the Devil's Garden begin to crack.
At the end, Rommel doesn't have the reserves or reinforcements to sustain his position.
With his defenses failing, Rommel has no choice. He orders a full withdrawal.
Rommel knows that he has to concede defeat at Alamein and withdraw deeper into Libya to shorten his supply lines and build up his strength again if he is to save his army to fight another day.
As British tanks pursue, news cameraman Terry Ashwood gets right to the action, rolling film from the top of a supply lorry as shells land around him.
Shelling and bombing can be quite unpleasant. So the next time you see this sort of thing on the screen, remember the poor old cameraman who was trying to duck and take pictures at the same time.
Rare footage reveals a high-level German officer in the act of surrender. General Ritter von Thoma is one of the most experienced panzer commanders in the German army. He's been captured whilst attempting a desperate rearguard action, protecting Rommel's retreat. Montgomery invites von Thoma to dinner that evening to discuss the battle.
I was staggered at the exactness of his knowledge. He seemed to know as much about our position as I did.
But aside from von Thoma, the British failed to catch the rapidly departing German commanders.
The actual breakthrough comes as a bit of a surprise to the 8th Army, and as a consequence, the army is quite slow to react to it. Montgomery also wants to be absolutely certain that he's defeated the Germans and Italians and that he's won this battle before he rushes into a pursuit.
The wily desert fox has turned tail, but North Africa has become a trap. 2,000 miles west, the plans made by Roosevelt and Churchill 5 months earlier come to fruition. Operation Torch, a massive Anglo-American invasion force commanded by General Dwight Eisenhower, approaches Northwest Africa. In scenes that foreshadow D-Day, U.S. infantry crash from landing craft, and paratroopers jump from C-47 transport planes. They aim to snatch total control of North Africa using overwhelming force.
Violent, rapid, ruthless combat is the only way to win. Make it tough and make it violent.
As Rommel moves west, he has some successes against the relatively inexperienced Americans. But despite reinforcements from Italy, his army is overstretched.
Rommel and the Axis forces now face Montgomery's troops advancing from the east, a new Anglo-American army advancing from the west. They're caught in between, and whilst there are going to be tough battles ahead, from a campaign perspective, it's game over.
Film from the U.S. Army Signal Corps reveals American lead tanks clashing with Panzer Mark IVs. As the enemy turns to flee, swastika flags on the rear become visible. They're meant to mark out the Panzers as friendly to the Luftwaffe. Now they provide a helpful target for supporting British artillery. Trapped between two Allied armies, Rommel advises Hitler to allow a full retreat. The request is denied, and Rommel flies back to Germany. He will never return to Africa. The Allies hunt down his remaining forces. In total, the Axis powers suffer 400,000 casualties in North Africa. It's a major setback for Germany's war effort. Mussolini's dream of a new Roman Empire lies in tatters.
Alamein is 180 degrees, from Axis victory to Allied victory, and really the rest of the war is going to be nothing but a series of Allied victories.
In London, Winston Churchill reflects on the importance of the events at El Alamein.
This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
Newsreels celebrate Montgomery's firm grip on the 8th Army and prove it is possible to defeat Germany on the battlefield. The liberation of Europe is no longer a distant dream.